In matters of science, a single observation may trump established truth. What does it take? Credibility. In 1937, a coelacanth fish was known only to the fossil record, and scientists said it was decisively extinct. Then a fisherman off the coast of Africa pulled up a live one. Bingo. Pictures were taken. Then the creature rotted, along with the concept of the ancient demise of its species. New truth was born, based on the awkwardness of denying the evidence. However singular the evidence was. The evidence for our next speaker's advocacy of the specific carbohydrate diet is more disseminated in time and space than the coelacanth, also more resistant to rotting. So the credibility of its sponsors depends on their eyewitness accounts. Those of you who are new to DAN must by now realize that you have joined a family in which the rules that prevailed at our first meeting 9 years ago of 30 practitioners, researchers, and parents in Dallas, those rules still hold. Listen to each other. Find common ground. Nourish your colleagues' experience before you try to starve it in the prison of your preconceptions. What better way to introduce Elaine Gottschall than to ask Judy Gorman, who weathered the storms of implementing the SCD with her son Alex. He had been over 7 years my most challenging and unresponsive patient, for whom nothing had worked until the SCD came floating by in the flotsam and wreckage of our efforts. Judy will introduce Elaine.
Thank you. Good morning. My son Alex, who is 10 years old and profoundly autistic, has the dubious honor of being Sid Baker's worst patient. He is also Dr. Marvin Boris's worst patient, and he's also Arthur Krigsman's worst patient. In fact, Alex is the patient from hell. Better put, maybe, Alex was the patient in hell. Nothing ever made Alex get better. He's famous in Dan circles for being the kid who only ever got worse. We've done the Dan protocol backwards and forwards, time and time again. In fact, we've done everything from cranial sacral therapy to Chinese medicine to crystals. We've seen a doctor who told us that Alex was autistic because his sternum was too tight. And we've flown to Ireland twice to see a healer. Alex has always had terrible gastrointestinal problems, including severe diarrhea, vomiting, gas, and bloating. His immune suppression was so severe that he's had to have gamma globulin IVs every 3 weeks for the last 7 years of his life. Prior to those IVs, he spent his life in bed with fevers, rashes, and vomiting. But in spite of this, he's always been a very sweet and very loving boy. Every intervention we tried had, at best, no effect, but most things actually made him worse. By the summer of 2002, when Alex was 8 years old, with his health and his behavior worsening, we continued our descent towards the lowest level of hell. He'd not only developed horrible self-abusive behaviors, scratching and biting himself so that he was always covered in blood, but he was also hitting himself against the furniture until he was bruised all over. Then he started to break things in the house. First, it was just remote controls. If you left a remote control out for a few seconds, it would be smashed into pieces. But then we moved up to telephones, answering machines, and by November of 2002, Alex was taking out our televisions, our computers, furniture, ripping the pictures off the wall and smashing the glass. He's not really verbal, so he couldn't tell me what was happening, but I knew. I knew that he was in agony, and the behaviors were his only way of begging me for help. Sid sent me to Arthur Krigsman, who found that Alex not only had lymphoid nodular hypoplasia, but also colitis and cryptitis. When I first saw Andrew Wakefield speak at a DAN conference in 1998, I knew what I would find if Alex were ever scoped, but it took me 5 years to find a doctor who would scope him. I just want to thank Arthur Krigsman and Andrew Wakefield for being right and for helping us. We immediately began to treat Alex's gut condition aggressively. With his first dose of prednisone, thank you, Dr. Boris, he stopped breaking things and he's never broken anything since. But he wasn't getting better. If we even tried to lower his dose of prednisone, his colitis would flare up and he'd need to use the toilet 15 or more times a day. We couldn't actually go anywhere because of Alex's constant need for a bathroom. In September of 2003, just 7 months ago, we finally hit rock bottom. Alex was doing horribly in every respect. His bowels were a disaster. In spite of being on prednisone, 6-MP, gastrocome, Prilosec, and Colizol. He was eating maybe one meal every other day and was sick constantly. His teachers at school told me that they were not even going to bother to try to teach him anymore because he was in so much pain that he couldn't sit still for more than a second or two. They said they were going to just try to make him more comfortable with sensory input and the like. And then Arthur Krigsman called me and said I had to take Alex off of prednisone because he'd been on so much that it was becoming dangerous. Without prednisone, of course, I knew he'd be back to smashing things within days. I agreed to come up here today in spite of being absolutely terrified. Firstly, because I figured it would be like standing in front of 1,000 of my best friends. And also, I was afraid that there was somebody out there who may have reached that point that I reached, where I thought, why don't I just take Alex and jump off a bridge because it'll put him out of his agony. And since I can't live without him, it would also put me out of my agony. And I can't bear the thought of any of you feeling like I did this past September. On that day, Arthur called me to tell me to take Alex off of prednisone. On that rock bottom day, I remembered something that has finally put Alex on an uphill course. I remembered that about 5 years ago at a DAN conference, a stranger came up to me and told me about a wonderful diet she was doing with her child that had done remarkable things for him. It was called the Specific Carbohydrate Diet. She recommended that I buy a book called Breaking the Vicious Cycle by Elaine Gottschall. I listened to her enough to buy the book, but I had a list from Alex's doctors of about 100 things long to do, and I forgot about it. I forgot about it until that day. And on that day, I pulled that book off my bookshelf, and I read the first chapter, and by the time I finished that first chapter, I knew that was my only and my last chance, and I also knew somehow that it was going to work. I started the diet by dinner that night. It may have been the one intelligent decision I ever made. And now to bring you to this present day, 7 months later. Alex is now off all his medications and having only 1 or 2 formed bowel movements a day. He has not vomited once since I started him on the diet. He is off gamma globulin and healthier than he's ever been. In fact, his only illness in starting the diet was one cold this December. He's eating 2 to 3 full meals a day. His attention span has increased dramatically as his hyperactivity and self-stimulatory behaviors have decreased. He's starting to talk more, echoing what we say in an attempt to converse. His teachers are awed. They're not only once again able to have him sit at a desk and learn, but they're actually getting literally 3 times the amount of material done in a month that they were before the diet. All his obsessive behaviors are gone, and all his self-abusive behaviors are gone. Most importantly, Alex is happier and healthier than he's been since he was an infant before he regressed into autism. I don't know how far Alex will go on SCD. However, as he is no longer in screaming agony, I can afford to be a little more patient. Every week he is better than he was the one previous. I not only think that jumping off a bridge probably isn't such a great idea anymore, but I actually think that Alex's and my life are both worth living. Because Alex is finally the poster boy for something other than complete failure, Dr. Baker was kind enough to give me the honor of introducing our next speaker. Elaine Gottschall is the ultimate mother hero. When her own child was incredibly sick, she didn't take the word of the medical establishment, which would have had her 7-year-old daughter lose her large intestine, but she did whatever it took to heal her. And that something was finding the specific carbohydrate diet. She went back to school, graduated with a bachelor's degree at 52 years old and a master's degree at 59 years old, and then went on to write Breaking the Vicious Cycle so she could tell all of us about how we too could help ourselves and our children. I, for one, obviously, can never thank her enough for her efforts and for once again giving me hope. My SCD support group is called Dr. Moms. You probably have seen us walking around with our T-shirts. On Friday night, we presented Elaine with a little present, and Sid asked me to please share it with all of you. To the greatest Dr. Mom of them all, the top 10 reasons we love SCD and Dr. Moms. 10, you get to talk about your child's poop all day. 9, you get to talk about other kids' poops all day. 8, you get to bake muffins at 11 o'clock at night when you suddenly realize you don't have enough for the next day. 7, you get to meet a load of people just as insane as you and talk about poop all day. 6, you get to spend $1,500 a month on groceries, $1,400 of that just on almond flour. You get to know the people in your, 5, you get to know the people in your health food store like family and tell them all about your kids' poop. 4, you rapidly become a 5-star chef. 3, you get to lord it over all your friends who still feed their kids crap like McDonald's. 2, you get to talk about your child's poop all day. And number 1, you get to see your child heal. Thank you, Elaine. With love, Dr. Moms.
Good morning. It's been a long, long journey, and I'm not talking about the flight from Toronto, Canada to Washington, D.C. But before I give you a few highlights of this 40-year odyssey I've been on, I'd like to express my appreciation to all of you, but a few people stand out. Dr. Rimland, thank you for taking the albatross of guilt from these courageous parents and for unrelentlessly pursuing the causes, and eventually we will find the cure for autism spectrum disorder. Dr. Sidney Baker. Dr. Sidney Baker, thank you for your loving, comfy, cozy invitation to come to Dan. Thank you for being this loving, wonderful man that I've gotten to know. Thank you for your Dr. Moms. I really am having the time of my life. And there's someone in the audience who does not want me to point to her, but I will tell you that there is a very bright, persistent mom out there of 3 autistic children who, her name is Mimi Clark, and unbeknown to me, 2 years ago, she started a support group for SCD called Elaine's Children. And when I heard about it, I tracked her down, and I think we had 30 people on that listserv. I think there are almost 100 as of today, and heaven only knows what's going to happen by next Monday. It was 1960 when I had a defining moment in my life. I was sitting in the head pediatric gastroenterologist's office at New York Cornell Medical Center with my 7.5-year-old daughter, and we were being prepped for surgery to have her colon removed. She had been diagnosed of having very severe, of course, ulcerative colitis 3 years before. Okay, thank you. And the medications had ceased to work, and he was going to make the arrangements for the surgery. Now, this was a child who, during the first 2 years of her life, had persistent and chronic and severe periods of diarrhea interjected with periods of severe constipation. By the time she was 2 years old, she began hemorrhaging from her nose. Spontaneously, we'd be out in the car singing and going to a picnic, and her nose would start bleeding, and many times we had to go to emergency and have it packed. By the time she was 3 years old, she began awakening at night with most horrendous seizures. We would hear the earth-piercing shriek and would run up to find this beautiful little girl. Are we having a problem? Okay. We would find her standing up in her bed, her eyes wide open, perspiration dripping down her face, thrashing at her own private demons, screaming that we were killing her. And it would take us an hour to calm her down and prevent her from hurting herself. and she'd fall asleep and not remember anything the next day. I don't know how we kept out of the hands of the psychiatrist, but within a few short months, the same child awakened at 2 in the morning, went into the washroom, sat there on the toilet until 8. And when I finally begged her to come back to bed, I went to flush the toilet, and it was filled with blood. And our nightmare started. We had gone to, in a period of these 2.5, 3 years, to 12, 15 different gastroenterologists, and they said if the medication didn't help, that surgery was imminent. And now I was sitting in this office and being told that, yes, we will schedule her for surgery. I began crying, and this doctor pointed his finger at me and said, "What are you crying about? You've done this to her." Yes, I know all about Bettelheim. At any rate, I went home and closed my bedroom door and cried and cried and couldn't stop. And then something interesting happened. A friend called, "May I come and just talk to you, Elaine?" "Oh, sure, Martha." And on her way up, she bumped into a third person and told her about me. And this woman said, "You have your friend call me, and I will give her the name of a doctor in New York City who saved our 2 celiac twins, saved their lives." And I jumped out of bed when Martha told me and got Dr. Sidney Valentine Haas on the telephone. And within 48 hours, carrying my latest hematology reports in one hand and stool culture reports in the other hand, we entered his office. And after a thorough examination, he sat me down and he said those very famous words, "Mrs. Gottschall, what are you feeding this child?" And none of the 12 doctors, not only did they give me no information on diet, but when I asked about it, they said it had nothing to do with intestinal problems. And in fact, even today, were you to go to a gastroenterologist, most of them, not the ones here, and you ask them for your Crohn's disease and colitis, what to eat, doesn't make any difference. Food has nothing to do with it. He sat me down and I said, "Dr. Haas, she's really not eating very much, and what she does eat goes right through her, or she throws it up." He said, "Okay, we're going to change all that. I want to tell you people who are struggling about whether to start SCD because you're afraid of it. This was a piece of cake. In 20 minutes, Dr. Haas gave me 1, 2, 3, nothing written down, not even the yogurt recipe. He said, number 1, he said, you've got to get her off of all fluid milk, but because milk has so many good nutrients in it, protein and calcium, we will make our own yogurt. We'll ferment it 24 hours. You can make milkshakes with it. She can have natural cheeses. They have no lactose in it." He was concerned with carbohydrates. That was nothing. I could do that. Number 2, she cannot have any table sugar or nothing that has it in. That includes maple syrup, very natural product, but unfortunately, it has sucrose in it. She cannot have corn syrup, but she can have honey. Don't believe it when they tell you there is no difference between honey and sugar. The molecular structure is different. He told me that children for years, sick children, babies, were given honey because it requires no input from an injured intestinal surface. And it gives them energy, it gives them good palatable food. But the third thing he told me was a humdinger. She cannot have any potatoes or grains. I went home, and in the car on the way home, I thought, how am I going to bake for this child? How can I bake her birthday cakes and cookies? And I had an Austrian friend who made beautiful nut torts, and I called her up immediately. She said, put some pecans in the blender, grind them up, put some eggs in, put some honey in. You'll have great muffins. I did that. Had you put Judy on the diet immediately. Within 3 days, the night seizures went never to return. My daughter is 51 years old now. She has 2 beautiful children. That same gastroenterologist had advised me she'd never have children. We have 2 beautiful, thank God, grandchildren. And she's never had a return of the neurological symptoms. The colitis, we were out of the woods by the end of a year, and I caught my breath, and I had no formal university education, had graduated in '39 during the Depression from high school, But I started going to the Rutgers Medical Library. And within a half hour, I found on the current periodical stacks evidence of some of the things that Dr. Haas had told me about. For example, milk intolerance, the lactose intolerance, had been known since before the 1900s, and not one of these doctors had mentioned it to me. We had no Xerox machines. I copied it down quickly and brought it home to my very positive husband, who heard me say, "I am so angry." We have known about this. It has been published from before 1900, and nobody told me. And then he said the famous words. He said, "Elaine, you've always wanted to go to the university. There's one 20 minutes away, Montclair State." He said, "Get in there and find out what in the blankety-blank is going on around here." He said, "I have to stay home and make a living." Macho. So like a good wife in the 60s, I took off.
You can use this
Okay,
one
thank you.
for the guys recording.
Yeah, I'm going to need the mouse. Okay.
So could you...
And I spent 12 years there. And when I turned 60, I thought, well, I've had enough. I was halfway through a PhD. And I began teaching, doing consulting, and had garnered enough information to write my book. My search in the university had one goal, and that was to go on a treasure hunt and to find out how something as simple as a diet could reverse an incurable disease. That was my 12-year treasure hunt. So I'm going to cover in the next few minutes that I have just one of the gems that I found among the hundreds and hundreds of research reports which I've referenced in my book, which corroborates why this diet is working. Now, if somebody wants to develop another hypothesis, be my guest. This was the best that I could do with the information that I picked up. But before I go into this beautiful research report by Dr. Poley, I'd like to give you a little overview of the intestinal tract. Now, here's our little mousey. Here we go. In 1888, do I need it? Okay. Where is the arrow? Do you see the arrow? Okay. Okay, thank you. In 1888, Dr. G published in a paper called The Celiac Affliction, what the patient takes beyond his ability to digest does harm. Let's figure out where this harm can come from. We have here an oversimplified, simplistic drawing of the intestine or the digestive tract that goes from the mouth to the anus. We have salivary amylase from the mouth. We have pancreatic enzymes coming from the pancreas. We have some protein digestive enzymes coming from the stomach. We have, and all this gastrointestinal tract is trying to do is take the large food molecules, long chains of sugars that make up starch, long chains of amino acids that make up protein, and get them ready for the chief actor in my little drama, the intestinal absorptive cell. This is the cell that is my favorite cell in the whole wide world. And all the pancreas is trying to do, and all that the bile is trying to do, is to get everything in shape so that that gatekeeper, that gastrointestinal cell, can do the finishing touches on these molecules, which have now become shorter, because without the intestinal cell breaking apart the last vestiges of starch, the last vestiges of some proteins, these molecules cannot get into the bloodstream and nourish the rest of the organs of the body. The brain, which is the highest energy requiring cell, is screaming for energy. But unless the gastrointestinal tract prepares these molecules of food, which are loaded with energy, that energy cannot get to the brain. So it is with the other organs as well. And of course, the nutrients, the vitamins, the minerals, the essential fatty acids, they too must pass through this gatekeeper cell, this gastrointestinal absorptive cell. Now, what happens if there's some impediment to these digestive processes? Well, we have a perfect example in cystic fibrosis of the pancreas. The pancreas is producing starch, fat, protein digestive enzymes that enter a duct and go into the small intestine and start working on the food. But in cystic fibrosis of the pancreas, that duct often gets plugged up with mucus. And these enzymes cannot reach the gastrointestinal tract, so these poor CF kids are skinny, malnourished, very sick. And they all have gut problems because what is happening to that energy that cannot nourish the brain, cannot nourish the liver? It doesn't get flushed down the toilet innocuously. It goes down to the unseen world of intestinal microbes and overfeeds them with all that energy that belongs in the body. And we have the Malthusian population theory of economics. More food, more entities, more people, more microbes. And when you get this overgrowth, and when you get a change in the acidity, which occurs because these bacteria, when they feed, will leave organic acids which raise the acidity of the colon. All kinds of things happen down there. You get mutations, you get additional toxins that would normally not enter the bloodstream, and some of them very well, and in fact there are many papers that show that one of the fermentation products, D-lactic acid, can get into the blood system and affect behavior in very dramatic ways. There are at least 20 references in my book about work that has been done for the last 30 years on D-lactic acid, which is a product of bacterial fermentation from carbohydrates. Okay, next one, please. This is to show you what the chain, I don't like the smells. Okay, this is a chain of the sugar molecules that make up starch. Starch is sugar. And if it's digested and goes through the gatekeeper cell of the intestinal surface, it provides energy. The sugars provide energy. But it's the same kind of sugar that you'd get in fruit. There's no difference. People who take their children off of fruit because of yeast infections and continue to give starch, I can't figure that one out. Okay. Now, after the pancreas and the other organs have worked on these long chains of proteins and starch, usually presented to the intestinal cell is something called a disaccharide. Sucrose doesn't require any previous digestion. It is a disaccharide, and so it presents itself to the gatekeeper cell and asks to be cleaved so it can enter. It can't enter as a single unit. They must be single units to be transported across the intestinal mucosa into the bloodstream. Again, if this does not happen, okay, and that's okay. I just want to remind you, yes, this does not happen. They provide overfeeding for the intestinal microbes down here. Okay. The last, I just have summarized here the last, oh, by the way, the butterfly. Why do I have the butterfly logo on all of these frames? Because more than one mother has come to me and said, my child is emerging from the cocoon and has become a beautiful butterfly. So I'm using, with all apologies to Microsoft, I'm using that logo. Okay, here we go. This is just a summary. It's in my book of starch digestion. And you can read this on your own. We eventually get polysaccharides, long chains, reduced down to the perfect form for transport, monosaccharides. If they do not get digested properly, here is a little diagram of what the microflora, the yeast and bacteria, do to it. Carbon dioxide gas is given up flatulence, hydrogen gas, methane gas, some of the organic acids that many of you know more about than I do. And what are they all doing for the microbes? They're giving them energy so that they can make more babies. Okay. Okay, this is the classical diagram of the gastrointestinal tract. I would only like to point out one thing here. Here at the junction of the small intestine and the beginning of the large intestine, down here where the appendix is, right in this ileocecal area is, I believe, where Dr. Wakefield found the lymphoid nodular hyperplasia. And I'm going to show you a picture of some of the lymph nodes down there when they have not overgrown and coalesced. Other than that, I don't think we have to dwell on here, other than the fact that Crohn's disease generally starts down in this area. The cecum, right here at the beginning of the colon, is where you get the greatest microbial growth in the whole gut. Now, this one is going to take a bit of explaining. If I took the small intestine and cut it across like an orange and looked at it through the light microscope, we would see, under small magnification, 100, 150, hills and valleys, hills and valleys. These hills and valleys are called villi, but we still, with a light microscope, cannot see this player that I'm talking about, the gatekeeper cell. We just can't see it there. They actually are on the top surface here, but you don't get a very good view of them. But I'm going to show you some electron micrographs of these cells in a minute. Right under here is something called the lamina propria, and there's a great deal of research going on right now looking at the number of lymphocytes, T cells, B cells, and how they change during certain conditions, or how they add up during certain conditions. So this is where a lot of research is being done on the immune system. And right under here as well, we have something called the lymph nodes, the Peyer's patches, which I'll show you in the next picture. But I'd like to point this out to you right now. If I had a picture that was stained properly, instead of seeing the same color along the surface here, showing the very small magnification of the intestinal cells, you would see red dots every so often if it were stained properly. And this is normal. These red dots are mucus-producing cells. They're called goblet cells. And in fact, right here, down here in the valleys, we have something called multipotent stem cells, which somehow are signaled by either the immune system or some other signaling mechanism. And if there is irritation, if there is any kind of irritation to the gut, these stem cells are signaled and told to produce more goblet cells than would be normal in order to lubricate the surface of the gut. Normally, these goblet cells will only produce enough mucus to protect the surface of the gut 2 millimeters thick. But just like I told you about the cystic fibrosis children, the subsequent drawings that I'm going to show you, or pictures that I'm going to show you, will show you that even without cystic fibrosis, we have abnormally thick layers of mucus because the stem cell has been stimulated to produce more goblet cells. Too many. Now, this is one of the Peyer's patches, and this is a fairly normal picture of the lymph node that is right under the intestinal cells that I showed you before. They lie under here. Most of the time they're segregated down to the end of the small intestine at the ileum, but they can appear other places. And why are they there? They're there because in the wall of the ileum and occasionally elsewhere in the small intestine are aggregates of lymph nodules. All lymph nodules are placed so as to be exposed as extensively as possible to foreign antigens, which are invaders. They provide a line of defense behind these wet membranes. They lie mainly in the lamina propria, which I pointed out to you under the intestinal cells, directly under the intestinal absorptor cells, but often penetrate underlying layers of the gut into the muscle tissue of the gut, where they may spread and coalesce to a greater size. And I suspect that is what Dr. Wakefield found. Now, I don't know whether Dr. Wakefield has as yet explained the reason for them being there, but I would speculate that if they are fighting off an awful lot of invaders, they would act like thyroid cells that produce goiter, where in an effort to combat these invaders, more and more and more cells are produced. And in Dr. Wakefield's work, you see huge lumps of these nodules coalescing. Okay, here we have an electron micrograph of 3 of our stars of our performance, the intestinal gatekeeper cell. You can see the microvilli up here. Now, I want to orient you and make sure you understand the difference. This is high magnification. The picture I showed you before with the hills and valleys, they were villi. And that was low magnification. And in fact, it is a three-dimensional thing that I want you to think about, because although that picture showed you only a two-dimensional picture, actually these villi are covered by hundreds and thousands of these cells here. So we're going to hone in a minute and talk more about this intestinal cell, which in fact is covering every one of these villi. Do you get that? Because I even get confused sometimes because they both have projections, coming up, and you have to sort of orient yourself. What I'd like to point out here is do you see the two cell membranes that are adhering closely to each other? Well, they are held together in what we call tight junctions. It's almost like Velcro binding. We don't want those to open up. But unfortunately, we've all heard about leaky gut, and sometimes they do open up. And the 3 reasons that I've heard for their opening up are excess ingestion of alcohol, which our children are not involved in, an excess ingestion of NSAID drugs, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, which we're not worried about. And guess what the 3rd reason is? Bacterial overgrowth on the top of the mucosal surface. They will open up as a result of bacterial overgrowth on the top of the intestinal surface. We don't want these junctions to open up, but unfortunately they appear to be doing that. And when they do, all kinds of things can slip in. Proteins that aren't digested properly, all kinds of things. Here is a greater magnification of our intestinal cell with just the top, the microvilli, which contain the enzymes sucrose, lactase, isomaltase, and maltase. And guess what's right next door to it? It's a goblet cell producing mucus. You can almost see the mucus being spurted out. In normal conditions, 2 millimeter thick layer. In abnormal conditions, globs of it. Here we see the tight junction even better. It's nicely sealed up by its desmosomes. Now I'm going to take you on a 3-dimensional view of what I've been talking about. It's research done by Dr. J. Rayner Poley, Chief of Pediatrics and Electron Microscopy, Eastern Virginia Medical School, and Children's Hospital at King's Daughters, Norfolk. Is anyone here from Norfolk? Because I've tried to get in touch with Dr. Poley, and I've been unsuccessful. I don't know if he's still there. I found this paper in the late 1970s. He took a total of 62 patients between the ages of 5 months and 11 years that underwent small bowel biopsy. And then as controls, he had 7 children without diarrhea, and they served as controls. In some cases, biochemical assays of disaccharidase, the enzymes on the microvilli, activity, he found them to be normal. That means that they should be able to digest all these carbs and transport them. Dr. Poley used something called the scanning electron microscope. It has many virtues for this kind of work, and not many researchers have used it. First of all, when you prepare the tissue for the scanning electron microscope, you don't have to subject it to as many washes and solutions and procedures as you do when you prepare tissue for light microscope and transmission electron microscope. So it's what we would call pure tissue. But the second thing the scanner does, the scanning electron microscope, it gives you a 3-dimensional configuration. It's like roaming around on Mars with the rover. The question I'm asking is, can carbohydrate digestion proceed normally in celiacs, those with sensitivity to gluten, cow's milk protein, soy protein, those with Crohn's disease, intractable diarrhea of infancy, giardiasis, cystic fibrosis, and children with autism / digestive disturbances? In other words, can carbohydrate digestion proceed normally so that we don't continually feed the culprits down there that are adding to the problem? Here we have a three-dimensional view of those villi. Remember them? We only saw them in two-dimensional view. Here they are, finger-like projections, lying there under very low magnification, only 57 times normal. And it's a control child, healthy 3.5-year-old. The mucosal surface down there at up here at the duodenum jejunal junction, which is the upper part of the small intestine, all villi appear of uniform height. The mucosal surface is free of mucus. I don't see much there, possibly a tiny dot. Where are we here? Tiny dot. Oh, darn this mouse. Okay. Okay, this may be a bit, but you don't see very much. However, here is the same magnification of the same area of a child, 4.5-year-old infant with soy protein intolerance. Oral tolerance tests. In other words, the child was given certain things to drink. He was given lactose, he was given sucrose in solution, and these oral tolerance tests always appear to be abnormal. In other words, I don't know what the doctors are doing today, but years ago they did a hydrogen breath test. And as soon as they gave the lactose, they could measure the hydrogen in the breath, which indicated bacterial fermentation. In other words, that lactose was not being cleaved and transported across the intestinal surface to feed our cells. It was going down to the fermentation tank and feeding the bacteria, which give off hydrogen. They did these oral tolerance tests, and they were always abnormal. The child reacted poorly. However, measurement of the enzymes per se, when they took the enzymes and put them in the laboratory, in the test tube, and measured them the way clinicians or researchers measure them, they seemed to be normal. Carbohydrate intolerance probably resulted from the inability of these sugars to make contact with the respective microvilli enzymes, and the sugars remain undigested in the center of the lumen, causing osmotic water retention and serving as an important energy source to microorganisms. Here we have a little higher magnification of the same surface. We still can't see my favorite cell too clearly, but every time you see a little circle here, that indicates an intestinal absorptive cell, and this is part of the villi. The cells appear flat. This is normal. There are goblet cells visible. Here's one here. You don't very often see constant cell renewal. You don't constantly see the cells sloughing off too quickly because of irritation. Here we go, 560 times on the scanning electron. Oh, this is a normal one too. We've honed in more. We now are 4,600 times magnification, and we now see the individual cells. Do you see them here? Do you see the little fuzzy coat, which is called the glycocalyx? That's where the last step in carbohydrate and some protein digestion takes place. And what do we see here in this normal healthy child? We see a goblet cell spurting out its mucus. Cell borders are clearly visible of these cells. The tips of the microvilli are covered with enzymes under normal condition. Same magnification of a child with soy protein intolerance. You no longer see the projections, they flattened out. You cannot see much, if any, of the intestinal cell borders as we saw in the previous picture. You don't see these at all. And it's the same magnification. And we also see colonization of the surface of the mucosa with cocciform microorganisms arranged singly in pairs and in short chains. We're switching back now to a two-dimensional picture, the transmission electron microscope, showing the microvilli. Where are we? Here are we? Here. Okay, here we are, the microvilli. Okay, down here. And we see all these happy families of culprits showing microorganisms colonizing in the dense layer of mucus covering the microvilli. There are cocci, bacilli, and some of them are making babies like crazy. Child with chronic diarrhea, back to low magnification with the scanner again. We see wasting away of the finger-like projections. Carbohydrate a considerable secretion of mucus. You see the strands of mucus here? Generalized disaccharidase deficiency as well as colonization of mucosa surface by microorganisms. Beginning of mucus barrier between okay. What is happening here is that the cells are trying to make contact with the carbohydrate disaccharides, and the mucus is presenting a barrier, and they can't do that. 10 more minutes. Wow, I'm almost done. Okay. Here we have again low magnification of a child with soy protein intolerance. You only see remnants of the villus ridges, flat mucosa, no tall ridges, and a general depression of disaccharidase activity. Here we have a close-up, 15,700 magnification with the transmission electron microscope of a celiac child. We don't see mucus here because you very seldom can see it with the light microscope or with the transmission electron microscope. It's washed away. But we do see that the little microvilli, which hold the enzymes, where are we? Here we are. Right here. They have practically disappeared. The cells are flattened. There's clumping of the microvilli. There is no what we call fuzzy coat over them, and exposure of the microvilli and brush border membranes, which are intimately associated with the activity of the enzymes. Depression of disaccharidase activity. Breaks in the surface coat of the microvilli in the vicinity of the microorganisms. These breaks could function again as entry points for macromolecules like proteins, which stimulate the immune system to go crazy, which then could initiate cellular changes and or damage to the mucosa by direct toxicity of immediate or delayed hypersensitivity. Often microulcerations and death of the intestinal absorptive surface and cells were seen, but the cause of this is unclear. A variety of factors, including microbial toxins, may be responsible. Oh boy. Chronic diarrhea, a child with no diagnosis other than chronic diarrhea. Large areas of intestinal surface are covered with thick and tenacious appearing mucus. Only the outlines of the villus ridges are visible. The child was clinically intolerant to lactose and sucrose, and this is important. When the child ingested these disaccharides, immediately there was I shouldn't say immediately, I don't know what the time period is, but there was, in time, hydrogen production and other symptoms. Although, when the enzymes were removed and put in the test tube and tested, the activity of the enzymes were normal. So it is important for these enzymes to be evaluated. It is also important to know that there is another factor, such as this mucus production, which can stop the complete digestion of carbohydrates. Excessive production of intestinal mucus and its interaction with the intestinal cell surfaces may result in the formation of a barrier to nutrients. It prevents nutrients from getting through. Even the vitamins, which don't need digestion, can't get through. This has been recently described in human giardiasis, and a similar barrier possibly exists on the mucosal surface in certain patients with cystic fibrosis. And now I'm going to get political and mean. I have been to cystic fibrosis meetings, and it is true that these children have a hard time gaining weight. And I have sat there biting my tongue when the dietitian up front said, we've got to get weight on these kids, instant chocolate pudding, candy bars, etc., etc., etc. This has got to stop. Dr. Haas, Dr. Haas had 4 patients. He's documented it in his textbook. I have his textbook with me, 1951, where he had 4 cystic fibrosis patients that were getting well. I don't know what the eventual outcome would be, but you cannot feed sick people that kind of a diet just to get weight on them. There are other ways to get weight on them. Chronic diarrhea again. Excessive mucus on the mucosa inhibits contact of the carbohydrates with disaccharidases, resulting in clinical intolerance, etc., etc., etc. Okay. We'll skip these. We'll skip these. Okay. In my book, I have this diagram, which it makes it a little easier to understand, of how these disaccharides, many of them, most of them coming from starch, reach the intestinal surface, and in a healthy person, they get broken down and go into the bloodstream as single units to give energy to the rest of the body. With an unhealthy person, you have the loss of the microvilli, you have the mucus barrier, which prevents the cleavage or the breakage of those disaccharides, and you have them remaining in the lumen of the intestine, drawing water in, causing all kinds of osmotic diarrhea, and eventually getting down to feed the fermentation tank of microbes. So, in summary, the vicious cycle, round and round it goes. Where it starts, nobody knows. Does it start with injury to the small intestinal surface, which eventually, yeah, I've got the right glasses on, which eventually leads to impaired digestion of disaccharides, which leads to malabsorption of the disaccharides, which causes bacterial growth in the lower part of the intestine, and even in the upper intestine. We're seeing it all over the small intestine now, bacterial growth, which produces an increase in bacterial byproducts and mucus production, which again causes more injury to the intestinal surface. Our goal is to break the vicious cycle. Thank you.